what we call climate and ecosystems health, and through this community of practice, we're really, it's a learning community. We're really trying to engage with how, as M&E practitioners, as evaluation users, we can be much more thoughtful and engaged in this process of really how can monitoring and evaluation contribute to a truly just transition. We have, and I'll put into the chat, we have kind of a concept note where we describe our objectives and some of our desired outcomes through the work that we engage in. Over the past year, we've been trying to pilot these two sets of evaluation criteria and supplemental guidelines in existing evaluations, and this is something that we want to continue to do to really ensure actually just that those guidelines are really useful and usable by practitioners. And there's also efforts on looking at how to integrate these concepts into planning processes and into monitoring systems, and then of course to be sharing knowledge. So today we have a special set of presentations. PDG, and so Cara and her team will introduce themselves just now, but PDG is an independent consultancy, and they are collaborating with Sustainable Energy Africa to develop the monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework for the Presidential Climate Commission's Just Transition. So this is a really great opportunity for all of us to really engage and learn and share ideas. So we're really looking forward to that. On our agenda, if you haven't already, please introduce yourself into the chat. We do sometimes actually get to share names and voice, and definitely throughout the session, please feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself and engage. But just in terms of introductions, that can take up way too much time if we do it person by person. Second on the agenda is just the opportunity, if anybody has any updates or opportunities or pieces of information that they wish to share that it would be relevant to this community of practice, please feel free. I don't have anything on my end, but perhaps several of you who are on, Mike or Ian or others, might have something that would be worth sharing with other people. And hi, Mike.
Hi also. Yeah, maybe just very quickly that this week a big toolbox on just transitions is being launched internationally at the Innovate for Climate I4C meeting in Spain. I think it'd be useful to have a look at. I'll send links as they become available through this community of practice. It's I think it has over 300 different tools, about 400 case studies of just transitions from around the world, including some work on monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which will be useful. So, yeah.
That'll be great. Thank you. And Ian, I see you have become visible. Nothing to add. Okay.
Nothing particularly. No.
Okay. So then, without further ado, over to Cara and her team.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see many of you again, some of you for the first time. I'm Cara Hartley, and as Jen mentioned, I helped to kind of co-lead the development of the M&E framework for the Just Transition, for the South Africa's Just Transition framework. I've got quite a few of my colleagues here, so I wondered if you could maybe just put your cameras on for a moment and wave at us. Actually, maybe it would be good for you just quickly to say hi to the group. Mike, if you could go first.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mike Leslie, PDG. I'm a monitoring and evaluation area practice co-lead with Cara and supporting the team on the Just Transition M&E framework. Thanks.
Yes, and Mildred.
Hi, everyone. I am also on the team for the Just Transition monitoring and evaluation framework. I'm working as research support and just helping out with the understanding of sustainable development.
And Lily too. Yeah, you're there as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lily Tukutlani, and I'm also a research support on the team. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's everyone from PDG and C. So, okay, everybody who just introduced themselves are from PDG, our company, my company. Yeah, so Mike and I lead the practice area there, and yes, I may as well mention, I've done this to a couple of people individually, that I may go on maternity leave, adoption leave at short notice anytime in the coming year or so. So Mike is my peer at PDG and would be the one who takes up the M&E reins more fully if that does happen, if and when that does happen. But the time frames is unpredictable. But yeah, I just wanted the whole team to be here, and also for everybody to become acquainted with each other, as I might not be able to mediate the relationship the whole time. And also to say that I consider this community of practice to be quite an important stakeholder grouping and set of experts or people with different perspectives who we'd like to pulse our work with more than once. So I consider this our first presentation to you all, but not the last time, hopefully, that we would engage with you, get your inputs, and really draw on your insights and perspectives to make this framework as strong as possible. Yeah, so let me also just open with that. Yeah, and then there are a couple more people on this call who are very closely involved with this project, but just not on the service provider side. We've got Katie Ross here, Katie, you're on the secretariat, seconded to the secretariat for the PCC, is that correct?
That's right. Looking after the M&E work at the PCC.
Yeah, so you're basically our client or our key contact on the client side. And then we have more than one member of the PCC's working group on M&E who are also members of this group, including Jen, Ian, Annette, and I may have missed a couple of people, but they also advise the working group.
Victor.
And Victor, awesome. Okay, so so we actually, if you consider that, then this community of practice is really bringing a lot of us together from different sides of this important initiative. So we'll be presenting now, but I think it's important for everyone to bear in mind that we have these multiple kind of influences and perspectives also on how the work takes shape. So having said that, I'm also aware that many of you, those of you who have been involved in this working group since last year, some of you since the hackathons in 2021, you have watched this project take shape from when the advert went out and people were bidding for it, and then when we were announced. So many of you have some background, but many of us may also not have that much background. So I'll be fairly brief with laying out the parameters of the project itself, but I'll break after that, and just if you have anything about the scope of the work or how it's put together, who's who, then feel free to do that before we progress beyond that. Let me share my screen. Okay, you're seeing my actual presentation, I hope. Okay, so yeah, there's two organizations on our side that's collaborating to deliver this work, and that's PDG and Sustainable Energy Africa, led by Megan Houston Brown. And our client, there's a few entities involved as clients. There's ICAT and UN Ops, as you can see on the logos there. But then in terms of who would actually work with this M&E framework and own it going forward, that's very much the Presidential Climate Commission. And so our engagements and how we proceed with the work is very much anchored with them, consulting with them and engaging with the Presidential Climate Commission Working Group for M&E. Here are the kinds of questions that I will be able to cover today. Yeah, and I won't read through all of them, but this is what we kind of where we are right now and what we are expecting. And I can also say that I'm very open once I've done my presentation to take your inputs on many aspects of what we are presenting. We are just at the end of the scoping phase, and so there is space to still shape the direction or emphasis to an extent. And we very much would value your expertise and insights from many of you having engaged with this area of work much longer than I have. So the way that the objectives and principles were set out in our terms of reference are as follows: that we must track progress towards a just transition, and that we must do so in a way that makes sense in this context. So to complement rather than duplicate existing tracking efforts, that it must improve policy and decision making, track all facets of the just transition, but with an emphasis on the social and economic consequences of our climate transition. So when it comes to adaptation and mitigation, the emphasis of the just transition framework itself is very much on, but what are the social and economic consequences of this transition that needs to take place, and the threats of climate change also for the social and economic well-being of South Africa. Of course, all forms of evidence is in scope, potentially, if it can provide useful data, monitoring and evaluation data, and that it must be socially owned, that this is actually an M&E framework for everyone, for all stakeholders of the just transition. It's not about a given entity either owning and directly, individually defining what it is that we seek to track, or seeking to generate all that evidence, but it's meant to be something that is collectively owned and then collectively contributed to in terms of the evidence that we collect and use to understand how we are doing in terms of our just transition. And since I don't think I covered this in another slide, let me just pause there on that point for a moment to say, as we've started navigating this environment, I've found it striking how people think, people's conceptions of what M&E is and how that differs in this environment across different stakeholder groups. A lot of people will kind of almost dismiss theories of change and causality and jump straight to indicators, which for those of us who have a broader sense of what types of evidence is useful, a stronger mixed methods approach, if you will, to evaluation, I have immediate knee-jerk reaction whenever that happens, because I understand the value of qualitative data, and also that indicators must still be interacted with each other in terms of quantitative methods, statistical methods, for them to be meaningful. But so that's the one interesting conception or conceptual framework that we've been encountering in this environment, is that it's all about indicators, including important and powerful stakeholders in this environment. And the second is that monitoring and evaluation has been so, should I say, conventional M&E has often been such an ill fit for the types of change and interventions that people in the space of development and high priority development priorities like these, they've experienced monitoring and evaluation to be so restrictive or unhelpful that it comes with a bit of baggage. People are skeptical of what monitoring and evaluation can actually contribute as we go forward, or they see it, they've experienced it being used very much for just compliance, just accountability and punitive accountability. And I think we faced that. There's definitely a conceptual communication, almost, I don't want to say battle, but it's something we have to be very aware of as we progress. I've started tending towards just talking about evidence, not talking about monitoring and evaluation, and saying evidence being preferable to indicators, because I think it's important for us to broaden the scope of what we take in. Many people will say they don't really see the value of M&E, but they would say, yes, we need evidence to understand and inform decision making. So sometimes that's a way of breaking down kind of mental blocks that people have at the moment about M&E and learning. So the project looks like this. It's a 6-month project of which we've just kind of, we're at the end of the scoping phase and wanting to head into the design phase now. We presented the scoping report, which we circulated last week to you all. We presented that to the M&E working group of the PCC. And now we are in the process of refining that. And there's a theory of change workshop coming up with MISTRA, who are developing the implementation plan for the Just Transition Framework. That's coming up next week. And one of the things I love your input on is how to make best use of a theory of change workshop with the people who are focusing more on implementation. What would you do if you were there? Yeah, so that's where we are right now. And this is kind of the key components of the final M&E framework that we see taking shape. If you have the scoping report, this is just a summary of that, and you can look at the detail in there. But the first thing that's critical here is to explain what's the focus of our M&E framework. The just transition and concepts of just transition are quite broad, and it's been important to us to say, okay, but what's in and what's out? What is our focus areas? What will we be interested in and what will we not be interested in or as less interested in when it comes to using evidence to inform the direction of the just transition? And if we have space towards the end of this consultation today, I'd also love your input on how to depict that in a way that's visually clear and shows appropriately where our emphasis is going to be, because we found that pretty challenging, even with the guidance from Katie and her colleagues and the re-emphasizing that the Just Transition Framework focuses on the social and economic consequences of the climate transition, as opposed to with the adaptation and mitigation interventions being the things that create those consequences, for better or for worse. Even with that, it's still been quite challenging to put everything in scope and communicate that concisely and clearly in a way that will direct us in the right direction. Then we need to articulate causality. I'm not saying theory of change, because the complexity of what we're dealing with, there will be theories of change. There will be many theories of change, but they need to intersect in a meaningful way. And we also need to understand the broader systems, with many things really only in the sphere of influence or risks or externalities, but critical to monitor if we are to have a proper understanding. So we must take a systems view to an extent in the way that we even map causality. And so I'll get to that a bit later as well. Then we've got our monitoring, analysis, and reporting plan, where I'm going to be like, okay, fine, you can now talk about indicators. We're not talking about indicators, but also other forms of qualitative evidence and monitoring that can take place. Very good to have Victor here, because they're really leading in innovating around how communities may be involved in feeding evidence into this and other spaces to inform the just transition. And the reporting plan that goes along with that. Then there'll be an evaluation and learning plan, with actual evaluations to be undertaken and how we will seek to learn from different things. And then obviously very critical for anybody who's developed an M&E framework is the operationalization. And I think at the moment we feel like you can't start too early with planning alongside those who need to be operationalizing this. And it's something that we really want to do well from the start, so that by the time we hand something over, we're just handing over a baton, but people have been running alongside us already and are ready to implement. Yeah, so this is a sense of the complexity of what we're dealing with. I'm not going to try and discuss the subject matter of the Just Transition Framework in South Africa much here. For this audience, I'm going to kind of take it as assumed that you have an understanding of what we're talking about in the South African context, what is in the Just Transition Framework itself. And I'm going to try and focus our conversation on how do we monitor and evaluate this and learn from it. But feel free to bring us back here if you'd like to. The point is that there's a lot for now. And that what we've kind of arrived at as an organizing framework for the time being looks something like this. Where is it now? Where did it go? Just give me a moment. It's on another presentation. Currently looks something like this. And if that's a lot of words, it is a lot of words, and we would love your inputs. That's one of the brainstorming type of workshop-y exercises that I love to do if we have time for it towards the end. I see chats going on. I see chats going on, and I am not able to read all of them right now. But so yeah, this is where we are. I'll give you all just like a few seconds if you haven't seen this, because we circulated this only on Friday late. If you just want to get a sense of the dimensions we're talking about.
And meanwhile, I'll try to fix my microphone because I've got feedback that it's not sounding so good. Can I just get some feedback whether my voice sounds clearer now?
Yes, it's good. And there was a bit of some other interference going on, so that doesn't seem to be here.
Okay, thanks. I just switched to another microphone. Okay, so we've been trying to overlay these multiple factors to say that what do we care about? So I'll just briefly walk you through what we've got here. At the top, which is the only place we found for it, in the arrow, we say all social partners, including affected communities, working together so that our transition to a low carbon, climate resilient society brings about just social and economic outcomes. Then, that means defining justice, defining success in terms of justice. So successful interventions on the left would need to have been undertaken not only effectively in terms of their objectives, but would have needed to take place in a consultative way, in a way that gives effect to procedural justice. So that's here on the left. And then on the right, distributive and restorative justice in the outcomes themselves for human livelihoods, health, and well-being. The Just Transition Framework has a couple of sections, focus areas that we know will be sort of the focus areas when it comes to intervention and action and policy to make these things a reality. So we've got the 3 here, as you can see, but we've also got climate finance and we've got governance as key focus areas, whether you want to call them enablers or focus areas in their own right that should sit next to these. At the moment, they're here on the bottom left, finance and governance. Okay, and then these outcomes, these long-term outcomes are straight from the final 5 or 6 pages or so from the Just Transition Framework itself. So you can refer back to that. We've tried to start sequencing them with some implied causality, although not entirely neatly and not pretending that this is the be-all and end-all of the causal relationships at all. That happens in the next phase. But the Just Transition Framework does set out some long-term outcomes. These are, as of August last year, these were the main long-term outcomes that stakeholders agreed on in consultation were going to be important for the Just Transition. So we have them here, knowing that they're kind of still they will evolve along with South Africa. We've also sought to try and classify them, although it's not a neat classification in all that. So yeah, it's important to realize that we will now move to a next stage where we unpack this to express causality in terms of theories of change or something similar, system maps maybe incorporating theories of change. Yeah, so that's what it looks like. That is our organizing frame as it's currently taking shape. It speaks directly, maps directly from the Just Transition Framework itself, as approved by clients, because by stakeholders, because that was the feedback we got at the working group meeting on the 5th of May. It was to say, we have already endorsed this through extensive consultation. This is the focus of the Just Transition Framework. These are the main areas that we want to focus on. The monitoring and evaluation and learning framework should start with what stakeholders have already settled on as the essence of the Just Transition Framework and areas of emphasis, even if it may evolve over time. So coming back to my my other presentation. So yeah, there's all these different elements, and yeah, I'll discuss that later. So some of the literature that we've been reviewing reinforces what's already in the Just Transition Framework. We've really recognized the importance of local governments and the capability of a capable state in general, as currently the Just Transition frames it as a key enabler, but just how critical that is and to what extent that cannot be taken for granted given where we are at the moment in South Africa, and therefore how important it is to have a good means of understanding progress and challenges in that aspect. The area that I think is the least mapped or defined in the literature we've been engaging with to date is the idea of justice, and how you may measure that effectively. There's also the element that's here on the 5th bullet here that talks about perceptions of justice being almost as important as justice itself when it comes to having a social compact and maintaining a social compact to move us in the direction, in the right direction of the Just Transition framework. That means that having evidence of the extent to which people perceive there to be justice will be important, alongside evidence of however we define justice being realized. Okay, so I'll move on now to the M&E specific content, which is where my emphasis is and where I think you all will be most interested. We've got two kind of risks that we face. The first is, as per this little picture, is to be way too restrictive with the type of monitoring and evaluation that we apply. This is a long-term, high-level, strategic, complex framework and strategy that South African society is embarking on, along with the globe. And this is the problem that many people have had with M&E in the past, is kind of encapsulated in this picture. On the other hand, we do need evidence, and we do need a degree of systematic and rigorous and objective evidence to be collected. So this is on the other side of the spectrum, if you like. This is also not going to fly. We need to have a way, that a form of monitoring and evaluation that is mature enough to do the complexity of this work justice, allow for adaptive monitoring, adaptive management, and responsiveness to what is happening on the ground, while still, and to do that well, it would be using appropriate tools that allow the kind of rigor and systematic engagement with evidence that we need. So yeah, from my literature review, from the review of the how do you monitor and evaluate the Just Transition engagement, these are some of the key takeaways that I had from the literature up to date. Obviously, that we're looking at systems transformation, so we cannot just be focusing on projects or even policies or other individual interventions. We need to be able to look at the sum of the parts. Climate change has, over the past several decades, posed a real challenge to some of the types of evaluation and monitoring that we've been practicing in terms of timeframes, uncertainty, and diverse understandings of success and wide scope. And I think I've already touched on the third point there about people's connotations with M&E, or formal definitions of what is an evaluation and what cannot be considered because it's not maybe aligning to a formal definition of an evaluation. The same could be said for formal definitions of statistics. Can we be flexible in our use of evidence without ignoring the limitations of the types of evidence that we're looking at? Challenges of causality and the dynamic environment that we're working within, and then how important it is for learning and adaptive management to take center stage here, and for whatever we design to facilitate and enable learning and adaptive management. At the same time, we need to work with the reality of what we've got. So I've already said about duplication, avoiding duplication. So we're by no means expecting that this monitoring and evaluation and learning framework, so wherever possible, it will pull in existing evidence generation initiatives, what entities are already mandated or legally required to be tracking and reporting on. One wants to consolidate all of that and put it within a comprehensive framework that's in relation to the Just Transition, rather than seeking to duplicate anything. But there may be a degree of having to advocate for redefining how some of that evidence gets, or how certain concepts get defined and how certain evidence gets collected and processed. So it's not just a matter of absorbing what is there, but also of influencing what is being generated by many parties. So that's how we understand the task here, and then identifying gaps where there is a need to identify new means of generating evidence and pulling it in. And we need to also kind of build the maturity of the overall system to be doing sound monitoring and evaluation at many different levels. Whereas this Just Transition framework, or this M&E framework we're doing, is at the national level, but it will rely on the quality of M&E that is being done at multiple levels. Yeah, and that speaks to the last point about understanding and capacity. If we are going to be willing to work with a variety of evidence types and with a variety of limitations to those evidence types, then it really requires a degree of capacity building and ensuring a maturity of how that evidence is interpreted so that it is used appropriately and not abused. This is a political environment. There are issues, concepts, and even what some people will consider facts, but that are still being contested by others. And so it's very important to be infusing the M&E framework itself, and then also capacitating those who will be the custodians of that to keep clarifying and sending important messages about how to use this evidence appropriately. Looking at different principles and philosophies and approaches out there, African evaluation principles lay a lot of the same emphasis as our Just Transition framework and fit quite well with where we want to go in South Africa as with M&E. And then the next obvious place to the next stop on the way was the Blue Marble evaluation approach or philosophy with their set of principles. They have a number of principles, each of them unpacked into further ideas, and I am quickly trying to school myself on Blue Marble evaluation in general. But a particular one there that seems that was immediately apparent and has implications even for how we unpack causality is the transformative engagement one. So there's a principle around that, and that among others, that one speaks to or proposes that we come up with a theory of transformation, which goes beyond what we've conventionally done with theories of change. And then the systems approach to evaluation, for a start, just drawing from the AEA's topical interest working group, where they set out how do you apply a systems approach to evaluation, and they speak to four important components of that, all of which have already started being relevant to us as we're trying to figure out how to even just define scope and as we move towards articulating causality. So our basic approach in terms of how we arrive at those sections is to define the organizing framework. This basically what we're in the middle of now, towards the end of now. Then to identify the successful outcomes. Now, as Katie redirected us after our presentation to the working group in the beginning of May, we already have long-term outcomes in the Just Transition framework itself that they do think should be the center of this exercise to start with. So it's just a matter of validating and deepening our understanding of what we mean by those, and doing that consultatively. Then for priority outcomes, what we are currently proposing, and I'm very keen to hear from you all, is that we map the systems that produce each of the key outcomes. And I'll show you a little example quickly afterwards of what we mean by that, or how we might envision that looking. And then to identify key factors and causal relationships within that system, including that which we seek directly to influence as the PCC, but as social partners in South Africa, but also things that are important causal relationships that we have little influence over and can at best monitor and understand well so that we behave appropriately to take them into account. And then we get to designing the means of measurement. A question that my colleague Mildred wants to pose to the group later is to ask you about sources, evidence sources, that we may not be aware of, or just to confirm that we've got them on our radar. Okay, so okay, I'm near the end of my presentation, so I'll continue, and then I'm I'll open for some general questions and discussions, and then we'll propose a couple of specific things we'd like your input on. So what do we mean? What do I mean by mapping a system? Well, if we say that, for instance, the automotive sector in Gqeberha, in the Eastern Cape, is vulnerable to adverse economic and social impacts from our mitigation efforts. Well, actually from the globe's mitigation efforts. It's going to result in a major shift in the global demand for automotives and shifting to electric vehicles. What does that mean for our internal combustion engine producing automotive sector in Gqeberha? If hypothetically we were to talk about these types of outcomes, and okay, so we could already rephrase this, right, Katie, based on what we already have in the Just Transition Framework. But if we were to talk about livelihoods being protected and strengthened, a thriving low carbon automotive industry and inclusive economic growth generally in that geographic area, then we might start by defining those. And in defining success, we need to ask ourselves, and in defining justice, we need to ask ourselves about vulnerability and opportunities to benefit from opportunities as well as be protected from adverse effects. And then we'll start mapping out a whole intersecting cluster of interventions and initiatives, which you can see us starting to do here on the left, but with a critical understanding that it's not just us actually shaping these outcomes, even in South Africa, and that different social partners have a role to play even in South Africa. If you add what's happening in the global space, that global investment decisions, which we don't have a direct theory of change for necessarily, but there's a causal relationship there feeding into whether South Africa manages to keep up and become competitive in terms of our automotive industry with this change demand. Global carbon policy, how quickly do carbon tariffs get applied? Yeah, things like that. And also how do other countries compete for this new market opportunity and shift? All of those things are going to have a critical defining impact on our outcomes here in South Africa. And so we can't just be talking about a theory of change with assumptions and risks sitting in the external environment. I think we need to take a more integrated and systems approach in the way that we show what all is going to contribute to our outcomes. I was just working with a very interesting program in the city of Tshwane on Friday that I think has taken a more responsive approach, and perhaps, if you will, a systems approach, where if they encounter a major contributing factor or initiative that could contribute to their long-term outcomes, they make sure to influence that initiative. If there is a community or a government intervention in the area where they are working, they make sure to establish partnerships, and they do it in a very responsive way. They encounter what is on the ground and behave accordingly, which makes for a much less predefined intervention and a much more complex intervention with lots of different interrelationships on the edges, but makes them better able to respond to the evidence emerging from what is needed and what they are able to do directly. And I think something similar is needed here, where there's an adaptive approach, where if there's something we can't influence at the moment with what we've undertaken as South Africans, as social partners in the Just Transition, should we reconsider that? Should we see whether there is a means of us influencing that and building that in? Maybe that's adaptive management 101 to many of us, but in many of the spaces where we've practiced monitoring and evaluation, the mandate of what this intervention seeks to influence directly is very defined and set. And the boundaries are so firm as to sometimes leave that intervention unable to mitigate the risks to effectiveness that it faces from the external environment. So yeah, we can't practice it like this yet. There's a range of stakeholders, and we are continuing to build our stakeholder map as well. In the links that Ian and Jen have been sharing, you will also be able to open the live link, and we'd love for you to give us some inputs on any major stakeholders that we've missed, including stakeholders who are evidence custodians or generators of evidence that we need to build in, who may not have been so closely consulted on the Just Transition itself and where we want to go as a country with the Just Transition. But now that we're talking about evidence, they become really critical for our process. No, I think that's pretty much bringing you up to speed with where we are. Oh, just to talk about operationalization. So a lot of this still needs to be defined. And there is still, in my view, a risk that we do a desktop exercise that we don't have the institutional architecture to take forward by the end of the 12 months as the service provider's team project comes to an end. So I've been trying to emphasize that the PCC does need to act as custodian, even if it's not its owner or direct implementer. And that it will be really important to almost have the political will and understand the effort involved in mobilizing these different evidence producers and custodians, as I've described before, and that there will be some implementation capacity required for sure to hold the framework and to, on a continuous basis, actually consolidate, analyze, and make useful to a variety of stakeholders the evidence that we will be pulling together. Okay, that was a mouthful, and I'm so keen to hear how this has been received, what is clear, what is unclear, and then I'll just quickly actually jot down a couple of questions to make sure I don't lose them in terms of what we'd like to prompt from you all. I'll keep the presentation up for now, so you may want to take me back to a slide or two, but open for general questions or inputs.
Thanks so much, Cara. So the floor is open. If there's anybody, Des has her hand up. Go ahead, Des. Then we can
thanks for a great presentation, Cara, and good afternoon, everyone. From my side, I wanted to understand with the social protection aspect, what is your scope or how wide do you intend to look and to collect data, to have the necessary service, stakeholders present on the social protection aspect? And maybe also then, am I audible?
It's quite hard to hear you. Your voice sounds a bit muddled, so there's some of the words are not clear.
Okay, can you hear me now? Hello?
Still not great.
Now as well?
That sounds a little bit clearer, Des. I think it sounds like wherever your microphone is, if you can move it a little bit further away from your face and just try again.
All right. Okay. I don't know if that is better.
Yeah. It's doing, yeah.
All right. So the first question is related to social protection.
Yes.
What is the extent that you'd want to be able to get data and information on the social protection systems or policies or stakeholders that we also need to look at, because social protection is very wide. And then the second one, it is on the systems approach. Maybe all the elements of the systems approach that you'd like to incorporate in this framework. Thanks.
Okay. Shall we take a couple? Was that the only? This was the only hand.
Yeah, okay. That was from me. Thanks.
I don't see. Are there any other comments, questions, reflections?
Come on, there has to be a lot.
Okay, Victor now has his hand. And Ian.
Thanks. I don't know if there's an easy answer to this question, because it fascinates me. When you talk about utilization, evidence that can be used, that it's also objective. I immediately thought about it will have to be robust and persuasive. but it'll have to be evidence that allows debates that lead to consensus forming. So, so I was wondering if you thought more deeply about that. You know, so if you, in other words, if you put out evidence in a report, then different stakeholders will use it differently. But you have some sort of power and responsibility, I think, to put that evidence in such a way that it's, you know, for example, not open to reckless abuse, you know, by being misquoted in a very misleading way. So I think it's an interesting challenge for all of us, really.
Thanks, Victor. Let's take Ian's hand as well.
Yes, so I mean, I think this is a huge task, Cara, and it's a huge task both in terms of the span of what it covers, but also because I think it's going to require a very different approach to doing the work, and because it needs to be quite emergent and it needs to be very responsive. And so I think linking to what Victor's point, I think one of the things that's going to be really critical is the process, because the process has got to engender, if you think of our evidence use framework, it's got to build awareness, it's got to build agreement, it's got to build interaction and trust, these sort of things. And so that process is very important. And one of the things that's just occurring to me too is to avoid it being too complex to try and do everything across the whole country. Where, I mean, one of the things we've had a bit of a discussion about in the PCC M&E working group, not resolved, but it's an idea I'm going to float, is the idea that there are some learning sites where we try and find out what's happening on the ground and use that as a way of trying to get some of this complexity based on real places. So rather than trying to do everything across the whole country in real places, we try and see what's emerging and try and maybe there could be focused M&E work happening in some of those learning sites. Obviously, some of those would then be places like in Mpumalanga or whatever, where maximum impact is going to happen. But yeah, anyway, just a floater.
Yeah, I will respond to that. Now we've got two more hands.
Two more
This is
hands,
great.
and then also some
Okay.
comments. There's a question in
great.
the chat about the process assumptions under each desired result. Let's take hands and then we can go to the chat.
Wait, no, we're gonna lose track of it if we go. I'd like to now respond to a couple of things first, if we can.
Okay.
So yes. Okay. So Des, I think that I cannot answer your question on social protection well yet. We need to work that out in practice, and also engage with the PCC and others to understand what underlies what was briefly touched on in the Just Transition Framework in that regard. For now, in addition to what we understand about the national social protection system and its the data that we have to understand the national social protection system, there is definitely also an element of geographic focus and sector-specific focus, where we need to understand what will be needed in terms of specific social protection efforts for specifically vulnerable groups or populations. But I can't answer your question in much more depth than that. It's definitely a discussion that needs to be had as part of the next phase with DSD and with also cognizance of other sources of evidence on social protection and where it sits. Systems approach. I think, so how are we using a systems approach in doing this work? I understand where it is sending us in terms of those basic principles that I put on earlier, but how it's going to work out in practice is still, it's very much a work in progress. There's a lot for us still to read and engage with. And for those of you who are further along in understanding how a systems approach may be applied in this space, that's what this consultation is for. Please do raise your hand and make any suggestions you have. You've seen what we have in mind as far as we've figured it out thus far. So yes, very open to and interested in your comments. I mean, the main thing that I've shown you to date, or that I've shown you in this presentation, is there's not just going to be a conventional linear theory of change that sits in the middle, and even to the extent that there will be many theories of change expressed and how they interrelate, that we need to pay much more attention to context, or what would usually be relegated to context in a conventional theory of change. When it comes to Victor, you're absolutely right. You're picking up on the right thing. We discussed the fact that that evidence can be contentious, that this will be a contested environment, and evidence will therefore be understood differently and maybe debated. We touch on that a bit more in the scoping report. And the main principle that we are going into, okay, so maybe two things that we've understood among ourselves thus far. The first is that we must certainly not assume that anybody holds the same definitions of these concepts going in, and so we can't just design evidence as if we already have a pre-agreed definition for these key outcomes. So that needs to be the subject of consultation and discussion and sense making together, to an extent now in these 12 months, but also we need to have a framework by which that kind of deepening of a shared understanding around key concepts can continue. And maybe Katie has a sense of how the PCC already provides for that. And then also, second point is, because we cannot enforce consensus on certain key concepts, that it is better to acknowledge differences of opinion, potentially, for instance, actually having two or three different definitions and therefore evidence sources on the same concept, than to insist that only one is valid. So that, I think, is part of being facilitating space for continued sense-making, discussion and debate, and understanding of different perspectives on issues. So there isn't an intent to insist on one single narrative or way of understanding progress. If we encounter seriously divergent understandings for some of these concepts, then we must be willing to allow them to be expressed and not necessarily harmonized immediately. And then lastly, Ian, about your, oh yeah, that's already very much where we're heading. Ian, you said, shouldn't we have some learning sites or something? We've had the sense from an early consultation already that we may want to have areas that are used where we can focus down geographically into a local space or into a very narrowly defined target population or key population, perhaps, not because they can possibly represent everything in the system, but for us to have a sense of what this looks like in practice, where it all comes together for a certain group of people or a certain geographic area. So part of what we need to do is to agree on how we would identify those sites. And the other thing is that this needs to probably start now and then keep growing, right? So we may only have the capacity to come up with a framework that would work for one or two smaller geographic sites. And also, I think there are some sectors that we still need to understand a lot better than they were able to be understood by the time of the publishing of the Just Transition Framework. And so there will have to be a growing, this M&E and learning framework will have to keep growing beyond what one will be able to put in place in its specifics in this first 12 months. Okay, and then quick response to people on the chat before I hear from Sue and Alma. Nested theories of change, yes, Scott. Okay, yes, but also, okay, and a bit more than just nested theories of change. That's what we need to wrap our heads around. I think Scott, you've probably got your answer by now. And Katie wanted to know, what are process assumptions under each desired result? Still to be mapped, Katie. I don't know if you want to verbally elaborate on your question, but the question is probably that we still need to unpack those. the answer is probably that. Okay, if Katie wants to speak up, you're welcome to do so now. Otherwise,
hi, colleagues.
Yes, hi.
Apologies that I joined a bit late, so you might have actually talked through some of these assumptions. First of all, thank you for doing this work. I think this is really a good way to reflect on the each sub-theory of change. But as you are doing this work, I really wanted to understand a bit more the political economy lenses you're also using in mapping this, but thinking about the process and process assumptions under each kind of risk outcomes you have here.
Yeah,
that would have given me a better sense of I don't know if you're applying this to specific South Africa example. What are those assumptions basically? But I totally agree that this is probably a next step.
So you mean process assumptions in terms of what I'm showing on the screen right now to the left? Oh yeah, okay, Ian is asking exactly the same question. Do you mean assumptions about how we in South Africa will be successful in arriving at these outcomes on the screen? Or do you mean assumptions in terms of what's the best way for us to develop the M&E framework itself in the coming 12 months and beyond?
Yeah, about the M&E framework.
Yeah, okay, some of those principles we laid out at the beginning, but and in terms of the why we define the process as we have, but I think that's also open for input here. And Ian, you directing us to the evidence use framework is probably actually a good framework for us to go and review and see to what extent does our planned approach for the next 10 or so months align with what we understand to be a good means of building a space for evidence use. So I've made a note of that. Okay, shall we take the other hands?
Yes, so Sue and Alma, and then I'm not sure, Paul had a hand up and then it went down.
Great, thanks everyone, and thanks Cara for fantastic presentation. So I've got two questions, and I think in a way they both relate to your enablers, which made me think they may be the killer assumptions of old. Perhaps that's what we call it, enablers now. But just out of pure curiosity on the financial one, I'm interested, how does this process connect to the could-be processes related to GCF funding that may or may not come tumbling in through our public institutions? So that's, will all of this work benefit that work when it starts unfolding? But then the one with more words for me is the enabler of good governance. And I was thinking, when looking at your framework, and particularly that beautiful map of the context in which all this work happens, the complexity of the system, and how when you're doing M&E for something so vast, you are of necessity in the place of process and politics. And I think Ian was raising this, and I think Scott also spoke to it a little bit in the chat. But so what's going on in the system, the living mobile part of the system? In a way, we get one chance to do all of these things at once: bring awareness of the whole system, help set clear indicators, help build capacity for governance to do all of this work better, both the rollout work and the setting up of the monitoring systems and the use of the monitoring systems and feeding them into the evaluative processes. So there's only ever one chance. And these things are, on the one hand, incredibly well-resourced, we know, but how do we welcome the complexity into those processes? And for me, it speaks to, I think what Ian was speaking to, the how we do it. Because it's in those one encounters where you're helping people think through what's an indicator or helping them create the framework, that you're also intervening into the politics, I guess, of how it's done. So what practices is your work going to be seeking to build in the systems that you work with? And what, I guess it speaks to resourcing again, but what resourcing is the system going to give to it as well? So we create an M&E officer, but what can that M&E officer do?
Yeah.
Especially seen through this lens, which is a lot harder than a little outcome story of old. Yeah, to do this kind of M&E. Thank you. I mean, I know it's a huge question, but it's certainly, I think, one that probably preoccupies a lot of us. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I kind of don't want to let you go, Sue, because I want you to make some suggestions, if you will, for how one can take this project and try to set up the system well enough. Maybe because Ian also wants to take us there a little bit with what he was saying, maybe once we've taken this next round of hands, let's have a discussion about that. We actually, all of us can make suggestions or try to take what we know and apply it to the situation.
That's amazing. Okay, that's fantastic. Okay. Thanks, Cara. I'd love to, come back into the conversation about that. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. And let's take Alma.
Hi, good afternoon. I think, something that Ian mentioned as well as some of the others is that this is really enormous, the task at hand, and extremely complex. And I think one of the things that I think comes to mind is that even if you have a ton of funding, it's still going to be difficult. My question is, to what extent can we maybe break it down in more bite-sized, usable areas? For instance, like if you do your mapping, really go and look at a sector and look at that sector and look at the different levels from the bottom up that makes up that sector, and then perhaps pilot a sector with whatever the it is that you have with your framework, etc., etc. Making an assumption that maybe you'll get much more learning from that if you then if you've completed that sector, going to another sector, but no sector will be completed. You'll always have to go back in terms of what's happening. But then really being able to prioritize the different sectors and then putting that whole thing together in a map. And I think then you can maybe start getting your mind around it. Because if I look at the total picture, it's something that you rather would run away from. So yeah,
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I look forward to responding to that one. Thank you, Arnold. Paul? Hi, Paul.
Hi, Cara. Hello, everybody. Yeah, obviously acknowledging the complexity of this is quite a task. Just two thoughts. One is around, you might have mentioned it, Cara, but it's not quite clear. So there's perhaps like an overarching theories of change or sort of the causal pathways that you're speaking, and that's what's presented over here. But is there an intention to go to a value chain theory of change level, so where perhaps the complexity can be built within, and linking to what Elma was saying, that you can start at a value chain level, perhaps have some of that complexity, and also might help separate where key data sources might be, or key responsible entities, or perhaps other apex policies or apex acts that are legislation that's driving change within that value chain.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, obviously, that needs to be underpinned by an overarching. So it's almost like a portfolio approach where like impact investors might have an overarching theory of change for what they're trying to achieve, but then within each portfolio or something like that, they might be more specific and hold a little bit more defined theory change. That's the one. And then the second sort of question is around, I think one of the questions you might have around data sources. I don't know if we're going to get there later on, but I don't know if there's been some work around positioning some apex policies or legislation within the country that might drive some of this independently of a just transition framework. Obviously the climate change bill is a big one. But within those different value chains, like what other sort of policies and sort of linking into the M&E components of some of those policies, or such as our NDC and the like. Yeah, so I don't know if that was articulate enough, but I was just sort of thinking around sort of mapping against other things that are moving.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Awesome. Hello, Mike. Mike Ward. Let me take your input, and then great. Paul is basically leading us into Mildred's prompt, so I'll try to get to that.
Yeah, thanks, Cara, and to the whole team that's working on this. I think it's a hugely important piece of work, both in South Africa and globally. So I just want to pick up on one area, and it's in the South African Just Transition Framework, and it's around this notion of ensuring that the changes that we support are deep, just, and transformational. And I think that we've lost some of the transformational dimension of this work in our focus on restorative justice. As important as it is in South Africa, a kind of restorative piece of work partly is backward looking, and the transformational depth and intent is a forward looking kind of deep change, what Jacqueline Koch refers to as deep change rooted in visions of dramatically different notions of production and consumption. And I think that that NUMSA picked up on this work as well as far back as 2011. We need to go back to some of that about what transformation would look like in this sector. So I think that there's a piece of work in the Blue Marble stuff that you've picked up on already, I think opens up some way of doing that kind of depth of transformational intent in the Just Transitions work. I think that as you do that, you're going to hit this huge political economy. And I think that the procedural justice aspect of the Just Transition work allows us to open up what are the kind of political interests in this. And it shouldn't be on the left-hand side. It should be a central focus area of this work. What is what are the power structures in place that mitigate against genuinely procedural justice? And so to try and move that kind of front and center in some of this work as well. Yeah, thank you.
Mike, thanks. I mean, I don't think I want to respond much to that. So just before I kind of release you, when you said on the left-hand side, did you mean on the actual left-hand side of the diagram or of the political spectrum?
No, sorry, on the left-hand side of the diagram, yeah.
Yes, okay. So what you're saying is procedural justice is a means of actually redefining some of our outcomes to be more transformational. We must provide space in the process for us to come up with a more radical understanding of what the long-term transformed system needs to look like if we're really going to solve problems in a way that they remain solved.
Exactly. And in that, you're going to need to monitor, evaluate, and learn our way into new ways of doing through the procedural work itself. So it requires an evaluative focus. How successful are we being? For whom are these processes kind of beneficial or detrimental? So I suppose the critical realist approach of for whom needs to be really central in this work as well.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Mike. And thanks for pulling us back to that. It is a point we could have made in saying, thank you for making that point again. Okay, so we started with Sue, and we're going to come back to Sue. Alma, you and Ian arguably are touching on the same thing, which is this is very vast. And Ian was suggesting, could you start with a few focused geographic areas to understand what it may look like in practice? And Alma, in a way, you're making the same suggestion. Could we start with a couple of focused sectors maybe, or should we break this whole M&E and learning framework down to an extent and apply it by sector? We were thinking that this diagram that you're all seeing on the screen now is best, it would be best if we actually duplicate it per at least every key sector and value chain. So rather than trying to put all the sector outcomes on one slide like it is now, but actually now, like let's just take agriculture. And then we have more space also to talk about all the different interventions and actions on the left and what exactly the outcomes may look like on the right. So I think that is kind of where we're anticipating we need to head. And it's similar to what Paul was suggesting of a value chain approach. If I understood you correctly, Paul, that you're talking about economic value chains, so at-risk value chains and sectors, is I think the way the Just Transition Framework talks about it. That seems like the most obvious way that we have to delineate these outcomes, even if there are overarching national ones, but the at-risk value chains and sectors is the obvious way to zoom in. So yeah, I think that is where we're going, but I think this is also something it would be great to have some further discussion about how one may approach that one. Yeah, and then let's talk about the data sources. Thanks for prompting that, because that's exactly what Mildred wants to show is what we've identified so far So Mildred, feel free to unmute and I'll put the slides, the 2 slides up for you to speak to quickly. Because we wanted to see us, this is what we've got, and what do you all know that you want to direct us to?
Cara, I'm not seeing the slide.
You're not seeing any slides, or you're not seeing the
No,
right
now,
slide?
yeah, no, this is the correct one. Hi, colleagues. Thank you so far for the discussion. I'm finding it very, very informative. I will say every time someone says this is a very broad task, I do want to pull out my hair, but it is okay. We will cope. Yes, so this work is basically trying to map the state's formation of how South Africa is approaching a just transition / climate change, right? Because you'll see very much, you'll see like very much climate change coded work, but in many ways, a lot of it incorporates the just transition. The reason I wanted to bring this up is, okay, partly, obviously, this hasn't incorporated what's happening in the civic society and what's happening in business. We would do a similar exercise. For now, this is just the state. And what this gives us a sense of is what type of reporting has to happen. Some of this is not happening. So some of this is because the climate change bill is coming to an effect. So it will still have to come. And some of this is happening to a lesser degree than is planned. So even if you go to the next page, you'll see that even the National Environmental Management Act also has requirements that in many cases aren't being reported on. But the sense we're getting is that while this is very helpful with giving a sense of what departments are obligated to do things based off of the legislative mandates, and it's clear that DFFE has some type of large role and DMRE has a large role. Going back to what Cara said, one of the main inputs we receive from the PCC is that we have to have a very clear socio-economic point of view. We need to understand the social impacts and the economic impacts on our everyday South Africans, right? So I just want to open up a discussion to see if any of you are able to just give us a bit more information or perspective even actually on the various ways we can get data, and particularly would be helpful is the various ways people are already collecting data. Whilst this does map what is obligated, it doesn't necessarily map what is always already being collected. So if any of the group has a perspective on that, please share. It would be much appreciated. Sorry, Cara, I'm done.
Yes, I see, and I can't see hands right now. Yes, there are a few. Okay, so Ian, I think your hand was up from even before, but let's take the 2 hands. Maybe they're responses to you. Otherwise, if anyone else wants to respond to Mildred, please do raise your hand or put something in the chat or whatever works.
My response is not to Mildred. It's a different point. Do you want to take points related to that first?
Okay, Paul.
Yeah, thanks. So I think maybe just a quick response. Obviously, the mapping presented here is there's a strong link to emissions / energy, which makes sense. One thought I had was just looking through table 1 of the Just Transition Framework, which sort of unpacks the temporal sort of risks per value chain, and also taking cue from that it's a social and economic perspective that this M&E framework needs to have. Emissions and the like probably sit within the environmental pillar, and thinking of climate risk and vulnerability from like a physical risk perspective probably also sits within the environmental pillar. So we might have to look at what will drive information in the social and economic pillars, and that might sit outside of DFFE. So we're starting to think around other data sources. So for example, like the trade environment, and sort of carbon border adjustment taxes. who's tracking that, which department, how do we sort of understand some of those things? So I think there's an element around trying to maybe unpack those data sources that might sit within other departments. So that's within the public sector and at the national planning sort of level. And then in the private sector, because obviously a lot of this will be driven, there's a lot of private sector movement within the space, obviously. And I think, you know, Kyra, we've had a little bit about this in the sort of sub-working group, but sort of thinking around at the moment, what data sources from a private sector could be utilized, and thinking around sort of CDP submissions might be a starting point, although there isn't a specific focus on just transition. And also, again, it's probably largely focused on the environmental pillar.
Sorry,
so again,
which thing from the private sector? I didn't catch that. Which set of?
So like the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, the old name for it, CDP, where they said would rate climate action from a company's perspective. But again, the questionnaire that's in there isn't quite geared towards the S and the E pillars. It's quite geared towards so when I say E, the economic pillars, as opposed to the environmental pillar. But I think there's, again, thinking around from a business community's perspective, where is there some information that is, sorry, I've lost my train of thought, but just thinking around some other business reporting processes that are applicable that might not be something we think of traditionally as a data source. And we might have to do some discovery. So, you know, for example, is there something within the BEE legislation that might unpack some of this, or is there something within tax reporting or something? So, yeah, so I think it's just about trying to figure out maybe where some data might sit in unconventional places that are applicable in this context. So this is initial thoughts. I don't know if that is helpful, but I just thought I'd share.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to respond directly to this question of where else should we look for data? You're absolutely right. The question is, where does, if you've got the adaptation and mitigation action and risks, well, mitigation actions, then where does the social and economic data sit, or and data to help us link trends and changes in the system that is going to produce social and economic vulnerabilities. I don't know if I put that well, but I think I got it. I think you get it, and I was wanting to affirm what you said. Okay, since there's no other hands going up, shall we take Ian's point? Actually, Ian, just before you speak, I just want to say, so I'm putting in the chat here what I understand them to be 4 useful subjects for us to discuss up until the end of our time. And if we had more time, we could easily fill it. So there's the 4 things I see at the moment. It's how do we design this process to set the M&E system up for success? So Sue's question. And then how do we break this down into more manageable pieces? If we have any other thoughts on geographic or sector/value chain approaches, then the systems approach, which Des asked quite close to the beginning and which I'd love your input on. And then the question that Mildred has posed and that only Paul has so far responded to. Paul and Graham. Okay, so those are my suggested points for anybody to then keep weighing in on around these topics that I've put in. Ian and then Mike.
So one of the concerns I have is that the complexity can also obscure what is maybe not the essence is not so complex. That the essence is that we have an economic system which drives exploitation of people, and it drives exploitation of the planet, and results in very negative outcomes on both of those. I mean, just as a matter of, I've just heard the figure this week of the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. At the moment, millionaires are likely to take up 72%. So that's an expression of the degree of inequality in our system and how it produces the devastating outcomes both on the social side and on the ecosystem side. So to me, I think having some sort of overall quite simple theory of change, which gives the overall transfer, picking up Mike's point about the transformation that we need to give towards a society and a planet which is able to thrive, is really important. Otherwise we get bogged down in the complexity. And then we can have the sub-elements, whether it's the nested theories of change or whatever, which show components of that. And you know, and then you can, but you've got that sort of bigger picture, which shows the degree of change that's needed. Some people won't want it to be clear because there are a lot of vested interests which are trying to derail the process rather than support the process. But the more I think we can make it, you know, quite simple and clear, the more people can see, are they on this path, or they're actually trying to stop the path.
Point well taken. Thanks again. Yes, Mike Ward.
Yeah, just 2 quick comments. So one is around sectors. The one sector that I thought was missing from the document that you shared around was the petroleum sector, particularly the refineries. And I think we've seen a sort of really stark example of what an unjust transition looks like in the closing of the oil refineries, particularly in the South Durban Basin, both the kind of long-term impact on communities and then the sudden closure. So it does provide a kind of case study of some of that. Might be worth having a look at. And the other one was really around, as we look for sources of data, also to look for other people working into this field. So, you know, there's so many, the large donors, the World Bank working in Komati, for example, the accelerating coal transition work that is going to take off, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, all of those, and potentially and I'm sure that this work is ongoing, but really to look at bringing in those partners and having a look at aligning the MEL processes around the projects in South Africa and the just transition work there. I think it'll also benefit many other countries that are going through similar processes and that often look to South Africa to lead some of this work. Yeah, given the capacity and history that we have here. Thank you.
Mike, do you mind putting that in writing or something? You mentioned now the World Bank and the data they may have from working in Komati, obviously the JET partnership, but accelerating what? Sorry?
Accelerating Coal Transition Act. So it's a $500 million concessional finance coming into South Africa that is supporting a number of processes around the just transition work. And it has a very strong kind of social, economic, and environmental component. So
thanks. If you could put, so I've got those 3. If any others come to mind for you or anyone else on the call, if you put it in writing and just pop it into an email to us, that would be helpful. Very helpful.
Good. And yeah, happy to make introductions if that's useful as well.
Thank you. Okay, we've got no more hands, so I think we are now in a space where please feel free to raise your voice to discuss any of these topics that I've got in the chat. Maybe we can come back to Sue, since Sue, you said you'd love to come back in and make some suggestions or have some reflections.
Well, just to throw in a few thoughts on the question I raised, and it does become a question of the kind of proportional allocation of resources, both of consultant time, but more so of the time of the people you're working with. So I think, you know, you've spoken about adaptive management as being integral to this approach, which I know is a kind of the current wisdom of us who try to work developmentally, emergently with a utilization focus. So what are we asking of the systems that we are investigating, prototyping with, sort of floating ideas with? You know, have we accomplished the work when we get them to say yes to an idea, or when an idea is said yes to? Or I guess the question is, what role do we have in giving the work legs inside of those institutions? And of course, a consultancy to set up an M&E framework can't turn into then what's it called, an update training thing. And yet we know that the opportunity to make the biggest mark on that system is when the ideas are originated. So how that happens. So it's just for me an interesting thing of how do we actually build adaptive management as a practice into the work that we do in even this conceptual field. And of course there are ways. But as I think what Ian was saying about sometimes it's simpler, not more complex. It's holding ourselves and our clients, for those of us who work as consultants, to the commitment to really change is the beginning, so that it doesn't just result as a technical outcome of a process, but we holding the whole system to the commitment to change, to the vision for change the whole way through. And I think it just asks for interesting qualities of all of us in how we do our work in the first instance, and then really giving adaptive management space to happen. So those are couple of thoughts. Yeah.
I mean, what types of shifts are you envisioning, Sue? Say, as we engage with Des and her department around social development and evidence that we may want to incorporate. What types of shifts or process elements are you anticipating might emerge from something like that, that we could, so we can set it up for success?
So again, I mean, and this may be something that you've already got factored in. So equally interesting to ask you or others here. Like if we are supporting a department to create an M&E framework that's infused with the considerations of a just transition, located in context, and trying to change, say, how the monitoring and evaluation is undertaken, what kind of time are we able to give to that process and ask of it? Do we just make the recommendations to say, do this and do it adaptively? Or do we say, okay, let's work together on what that means? Have we really landed the idea of working adaptively? So it's that kind of, I guess, working at that micro level, but giving real time to engaging the system on what it means to change, just in how you speak about something, the questions you ask of your downstream people, the kind of data you're asking for. The question of data has come up here. The way in which you get your staff to understand why that shift, why that tweak in the data, why you have to invent a new form again. So boring. People go to sleep. You know, how do you engage that? Yeah, so it involves small changes all along, but it does take time and therefore money. Yeah. So I don't know if is that
I think that takes us in the right. What's shaping up for me is, we mustn't just set up the PCC or to be the custodian. We mustn't just work alongside if there is administrative capacity availed in advance, which is what we're hoping for by the time before we leave, to work alongside them. But should we have some, yeah, you're right. The consultancy itself is not going to be able to engage deeply with any one stakeholder. And if we envision the need for multiple processes of changing of M&E frameworks or updating them or something, is there some kind of is the PCC working group itself for M&E may become this, where they can hold longer term processes of maturing M&E systems in line with what we come up with? Or is there a need for a system or a structure that's more directly just composed of the key evidence custodians that can talk together and keep working on these processes together? Jen, you're saying, did you want to come in?
No, I mean, this is a very good question as to these processes that she's talking about. Where are they? Where should they be sitting, or who is engaged in that? Because I mean, the PCC is sort of at a very high level, but actually implementing and transforming the system requires working at all different levels and with all various different stakeholders. This is in Ian's comment about this is why the learning site model, really could add a lot of value.
Victor didn't have opportunity to speak before he had to go, but he is piloting community-based monitoring and evaluation approaches in, I think, 2 or 3 actual communities, with the purpose not to be directly feeding into our work, feeding into it as possible, but also sitting outside it to an extent so that they can put some hold the Just Transition ECC accountable. But so they'll be coming up with some examples from experience of how that may look, at least at the local level. Yeah.
Katie, yes. To close my query, just to say I really appreciate even this engagement, and it can sound like a bit of a buzzkill to raise these questions, but I think they really do preoccupy all of us, especially when we're working at a high conceptual level. And so the thing I take out of this engagement is what I put in the chat box as well, that we need to be explicit on what the necessary conditions are for success of our change efforts. And even if we can't all be held responsible for them all the time, we are doing the change all the time. And if the clients and the systems that we're working with are receiving that, and there's like an understanding of what it implies, then we're not deferring the change down the line to the poor desk clerk who then has to do something different without any support. But we're actually building that in all along. Yeah. So I appreciate that, grateful and happy to sort of let us go elsewhere as well. But it's got me thinking a lot harder about this thing that I'm clearly very committed to as well. So thank you.
Certainly resonates with me and I think many of us. Oh, thank you. I see Paul's got his hand up, and then I want to hear whether Katie doesn't have anything to add. But let's hear from Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of linked to where we're saying that it's that point around ownership of this, and I think if you look through the actual framework and towards the end where they sort of highlight responsibilities on certain actions, I mean, I think it's quite high level and multiple responsibilities, and I think just unpacking sort of because it's cross-cutting, because there are many actors at play doing things already, is really trying to understand of those actors and of those things that are in play, where's the piggyback opportunity, or like where is an M&E framework that's going to be developed for something within a national department, and obviously under the assumption that M&E framework is sound and solid and things will happen. And I think that's obviously the challenge with climate change, is because it is cross-cutting, it needs to be integrated across departments, across functions, across sectors. And then I guess the role of the PCC within that context and the role of this M&E framework, and sort of how we get that marriage. So I think there is value in trying to unpack within the value chain, what is happening within those line departments, what is happening. Are they developing plans that will have an M&E framework? Is there something we can leverage and piggyback on? Or, so I think, and similarly, like, with the coal value chain, what is the private sector doing? What are the coal miners doing? What's happening in their social labor plans, etc.
Yeah, just to affirm this notion, and of course, this will have to be an ongoing thing, but also, if we do end up agreeing, okay, now we must unpack this by a value chain and sector, then that'll make it a bit simpler to allocate to different people. But just to affirm, this is a stripped out version of the picture that I showed you earlier. Okay, there's the picture, and these are all the elements that we were trying to put in one picture. So basically, wherever we encounter efforts to set up M&E systems or existing evidence, if it speaks to these things and where any of these things intersect, then it's of interest to us. So we may be able to identify things as being of interest, and then we must figure out now, how do we incorporate it? Katie.
Thanks, Cara, and wanted to thank everyone on the call today for the excellent participation, and Cara, to you and your team for facilitating this and spurring such wonderful engagement. At least from the PCC side, our critical task at the moment is coming up with what are the levers that will affect change for South Africa towards a just transition. And really wrestling with the question about how to drive system-wide transformations versus incremental shifts, and also spurring this change across all the different social partners in South Africa. So as Cara mentioned, we're gathering a small group to talk about what a theory of change looks like for a just transition in early June. Cara and her team are going to be key inputs into that, about what are the levers, how do we affect change, how does change happen in South Africa, what processes have gone well in terms of theories of change in South Africa, what haven't, what can we learn from them. And the idea is then to bring an emerging frame for this to the PCC's quarterly commission meeting that's going to be hosted on the 9th of June. And that's going to be broadcast to all, where we are hoping to open up a debate and discussion on how we'll affect change for towards a just transition in the country. And then this frame is going to be the basis for the work that Cara and her team are developing, as well as the team at Mistra, who's developing a just transition implementation plan for the country. So we're aiming to have both streams of work have this common departure point and work on these things simultaneously. So please look out for that. The M&E group in PCC is expanding as well. So I just posted a job description in the chat. I'd be very grateful if you wanted to share that with your networks. It's obviously a time to help shape this just transition work in the country. It's obviously very new and innovative, so we're looking to attract a wide pool of candidates. And as Cara said, I think these sessions are really helpful in gathering a broad group of perspectives on how we give effect to all of this. So I look forward to more opportunities to do this again. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie.
So I don't know if we want to go back to some of your specific questions, or thinking maybe Scott might want to add something about the theory of transformation. Ian has been saying that, like, within in another group, they've been trying to actually, like, it's very difficult to come up with a theory of transformation. But really it is.
This blue marble evaluation will deliberately point you in a direction, but now we must all go and apply. So Ian, you're trying to apply that one. Yeah, I'm sure it's not easy. Scott.
Well, I think even he was saying that Michael Quinn-Patton has been trying to explain how to do it, but there hasn't actually been very many actual examples of it put into place. So
yeah, I guess that's kind of what I mean as well. Yes, the handbook is not exactly a how-to that
the ideal.
I actually have to peel off and pick up my daughter from school right now. She gets to get picked up on the hour. But I think everything that you just said kind of summarizes what I'm seeing. I think there's a good amount of a talk about a theory of transformation, and I've seen a couple, but they're ultimately they're conceptual models of reality. And as conceptual models, we need to realize that they're limited in their capacity to explain reality. And so I think if there's a way to visually represent that sense checking, that interrogation of looking at the conceptual model and coming back in the feedback loops, which go back to the point that was made earlier about the importance of assumptions and looking at the political, economic, and also environmental. A lot of the work that I've done in the past, you can have an extreme weather event, an earthquake, or something like that, that can have a major impact on the operational context and the intervention that's being unpacked there. So, but I have to peel off. This has been a terrific presentation, though. I came in a little late, and I'm really glad I made the effort to log on. So thank you again, and I'll see you all later.
Thanks, Scott. I'm not sure if there are any other reflections, questions.
Yeah, Ian, is there, it looks to me, Jen, like we maybe are moving towards wrapping up the session, but just Ian, in what space have you been trying to do the theory of transformation, if not the food systems one that is kind of featured in the book as well?
Sorry, I was just carrying a cup of tea. Did you say what you're saying? In what space was the food systems transformation one done?
Not the food systems one. Jen sounded like you were trying to apply it in some other space, some third space.
Well, we actually, for the International Evaluation Academy, we were trying to explore the idea of how could we do a theory of transformation for the academy, and what the academy was trying to do. So we have started exploring that, and then also in a climate initiative that we've been trying to get going with GEI, the Academy and GEI. We've also been sort of beginning to explore it. But I'll share have you seen the theory of transformation that Michael developed for the food systems? It's extremely high level.
No, I haven't looked at it in depth. Thanks.
I'll share that. I'll share that with you.
Thank you. And there is a Blue Marble community of practice, including a Southern African chapter. So I was wondering if we shouldn't hear from them if they've got more experience with applying some of these concepts in practice. Maybe we'll invite them to come to the next session here and share some examples. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap in membership anyway.
All right, it's Mike Ward here. I just wanted to highlight as well the work that the Transformational Change Learning Partnership has been doing. It's a partnership of probably 600 individuals globally, and about 350 institutions that over probably the last 6 years have been trying to define what we mean by transformational change. So it's developed a definition that has a number of normative dimensions that I think are relevant to this, including, climate neutrality, inclusivity, equity, resilience, and building sustainable development pathways. So it has that normative dimension that I think is important. It has a number of dimensions that are also, I think, relevant here. And around each of those dimensions asks quite sort of basic questions, as well as sort of more detailed questions that I think are useful for evaluative processes. So the dimensions, I won't go into much detail, but things like relevance, what is planned? So what is needed really? So what is kind of in our nationally determined contributions? What is planned through a just transition process, maybe an investment plan or something? And are they aligned? And that simple kind of set of questions just helps us to look at the alignment of our policy work. It asks questions around systems. So who defines systems boundaries is absolutely key, because where the system boundaries are defined means that certain actors are invited in or excluded. And then who gets to decide in those processes. So the procedural justice dimension of who's defining system boundaries. It looks at speed, so the relationship between the urgency of climate and the complexity of situations, which really talks to just transitions work. Scale and how we scale across vertical, horizontal, depth scaling, and then adaptive sustainability, so all the adaptive capacity. So that work is ongoing, and it sits at the very core of some of the big projects that are going on in South Africa, because they're actually what they refer to as investment criteria. So they're criteria for South Africa taking on these various investment possibilities from international donor funds. So again, it would be perhaps useful to look at some of that. It's certainly going to be part of the MEL processes of some quite big projects in South Africa. And so that Just Transition, TCLP, it's called, Just Transformational Change Learning Partnership would be useful to have a look at.
Thank you.
And maybe just to say that Scott Chaplow is doing a chunk of work with the TCLP to try and understand the evaluative potential of that. Ian's done some work with us. So yeah, so there's a fair bit of kind of connection across these communities of practice into there.
Well, great. So we have just 10 minutes left scheduled. Cara, in terms of for your team, any ways forward, are you going to be sending us something that you want us to comment, people to comment on if they have desire to do so?
Yeah, I mean, I can see the slides that I just presented. I don't think I've shared those before, but I think I'm left. Okay, so this shouldn't be the last time that we engage in this community of practice on this project. So let's make sure that there's a next time. But I'm left wondering how to factor all these great insights and suggestions into and to apply them. I'm not. It's a bit overwhelming, and I'm trying to figure out. We've taken lots of notes here. I also want to make space for people to send us email inputs as we go ahead. But I also then I'm not sure that like how much input we can actually deal with and follow through in a useful way. So I don't know if anyone else has a suggestion. Otherwise, I'm just going to say, here's our email addresses. Send us your inputs, and we will try within the limits of our capacity to actually go and engage with awesome resources and inputs and so on as the best we can.
There's a hand from Zani.
Hi, Cara, can I come in?
Yes, hi.
Hi. Mfunzeni Chindani here from the Western Cape government. I just want to add on the point which Michael just mentioned about projects at scale happening in South Africa. And it also talks to one of the questions where you asked about data points. So us as the province are working very closely with the National Department of Environmental Affairs, where we're collating adaptation projects and efforts, not just those which are funded internationally, but even those which are happening at community level. And although they're happening in bits and pieces and at various scales, we're really trying to align with their climate change response database, which I think is also a good platform to try and draw some of the social and economic aspects from an adaptation lens, though, which is much complicated compared to looking at it from mitigation. So I've just pasted the link on the chat there, which you can go and visit and find some more information on this. Thanks.
Thank you. Is the chat getting saved somehow?
Yes, so it should be saved when I close and everything is saved, but I'll also pull everything from the chat and put it onto a Word document just to make sure. So yeah.
Thank you for that, Mfunzeni.
Sure. Okay, so then just very quickly, briefly, and I did put it into the chat, but there is now a listserv for this community of practice through the CEMIA, and I would really like to be moving to use the listserv as the main ways of communication. So I've sent it in email. It will get sent out a couple of times, but just to say that it just will make it easier, and so people don't get emails with 60+ people in the list. And to join the listserv, you just need to be a registered user of CEMIA. You don't necessarily have to be a member, although that's very much welcome. And the listserv is Cara was past president or past chair of CEMIA, so that's why she's nodding vigorously. So and I mean, both with the general email as well as with the listserv, it should be a cross-way communication. I don't want to be the only one who's sending out messages. And then also a little update, and I actually should have mentioned this earlier. There's a GLOCAL is taking place from next week, Monday. So GLOCAL is the Global Local Evaluation Week, where there are presentations and workshops being hosted by people across the globe. So it's basically like a 24-hour, 7-day week M&E conference. And on Monday, the 29th, we will be we'll be doing an event with footprint evaluation. So Ian and I will be sharing about the two sets of guidelines and footprint, Andy Rowe, and then we'll be sharing about a case that they've done in Uganda, applying the footprint evaluation approach. So we welcome you. I'll share that via email and via the listserv. And we definitely welcome your engagement in that event. And there will be many other really interesting sessions happening through Global. So thank you very much. Cara is also asking if there's anybody who's participating in the Daily Maverick, the gathering on Friday happening in Cape Town. So you can connect. Great. Well, thank you. And we will be having our next meeting in June. I'll set up a date, and during our next meeting, most likely we'll be going back to working in smaller groups, focusing on kind of the key working areas. So looking at evaluations, looking at planning and monitoring systems, looking at a subgroup on private sector or non-governmental sector. And so we look forward to your engagement then. Otherwise, thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Let's take care.
Just quickly trying to copy or download in links.
Yeah.
Or files that were shared. Just in case
Yes, yes.
Okay, it's just.
Yeah, there are quite a few good good links.
Like diagrams and documents and things. The links we will be able to get after. Okay, thanks, Jen, for the platform and the encouragement along the way. It's very overwhelming, as you can see. It's like, sure.
But I mean, you got some really good inputs.
Yeah, really good. And I'm so glad Katie was there and that she actually stayed pretty much to the, oh, she's still here, stayed to the end, because I think being in tune with Katie and the PCC all the way is also a really important part of being successful. And like if we come up with a change to the process for this, like for this 12 months, if we and Katie